Moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Sharon Richardson, who is a senior scientist and lecturer in geocomputation at the University of Zurich, and she joined Zurich just before Christmas. The title of her talk is Learning the Social Heartbeat of an Urban Landscape with Real-Time Data. So thank you very much. Over to you, Sharon.
Okay, thank you, and I will also just, let's get my screen shared. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great, thanks for the nods, always appreciated. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is almost the next layer up from what we've just heard about from Ed, and it's looking at how we can use mobile data to reveal social atmospheres. So bringing time into our study of space. How does the atmosphere of a location change at different times of day, at different times of year, and so forth? And if you just look at this photo on screen, it's a couple walking down a street. Instantly, we can look at this and make a judgment that it's probably autumn or winter time because they're wearing coats. It looks quite grey and damp. It looks like there's possibly a market down the left-hand side. There's quite a few people around. How typical is this scene of this space? Is it like this all the time? Is it more crowded in the summer or less crowded? It can go both ways depending on different land uses. And for me, this is the real potential of mobile data, is we can start to get temporal patterns to understand where we start with a baseline average, how much variation we can see in a space. Different data sources can give us all sorts of different information, but today I'm just going to talk through a couple of examples around presence. How many people are present and potentially what are they doing? I'm going to use a single landscape as an example here, which is the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford, East London. It's where I did a lot of my research for my doctorate. And if we just look at the map here, you should be familiar, have heard of it at least from the London 2012 Olympics. But since the Olympics, it's been redeveloped and it's now very much a pivotal part of a very built up area. So it's surrounded by a lot of residential, commercial, retail districts. It's a very large park, you know, and the intention is to understand better how the park is used. And hopefully this animation is starting to show up on screen. I'm always slightly nervous with a video. Can everyone see that playing? Thank you. So what we're seeing here is mobile app data. The green dots are mobile devices that have visited this landscape at least 3 times during a month. The purple dots are devices that visited maybe once or twice. And it's just showing the connection of the device readings on an hourly basis throughout the whole month of June 2017. And just as we play it, we get that heartbeat of day to night rhythm going through. But we also see flare-ups for different events taking place throughout the daytime, through the weeks, and through into the weekends. And I'm just watching the counter up to the 15th of June. So you can see it's quite green at the moment. And it's about to go very purple. There we go. And so that were the 2 Guns N' Roses concerts that took place on those 2 days at the park. So we can see we get a real different population in the park when we have things like these music concerts taking place. So it's really interesting data to look at, but we need to turn it into some kind of insight. How do we actually act with these sorts of data? And so I argue that we need to define the location-based context that we're interested in. And we start with that spatial baseline. And actually, this is the bit we don't need the mobile data for. We've just seen what we need for getting that spatial baseline. We need to do a thorough spatial analysis. But from that baseline, mobile data can give us 2 different time dimensions. It can give us the temporal dynamics. And these are the regular rhythms, the day to night, the week to weekend, the summer to winter, the recurring holidays, Easter, Christmas, things that happen on an annual basis. You know, these rhythms give us a certain dynamic with some regularity, some consistency. But on top of that, there are the adaptions, the abnormal conditions, the one-off events, the incidents, the emergencies, the extreme weather events, and these create changes from those temporal rhythms. But across both of them also is a reaction sensitivity. You know, we always need to appreciate that when we're capturing real-time data, we don't have a complete picture because people do react differently. Some people in the winter, if it's an unexpectedly warm day, will go to the park, we go. Others will be like, it's winter, I don't go to the park in the winter. So not all reactions are the same. We have to allow a certain amount of human nature kicks in here and gives us plenty of uncertainty. But by starting to build this structure in, we can develop a framework, and then we're starting to measure this data and turn it into some insights. So if we're interested in a particular population behavior, we get that spatial baseline, we learn that cyclic dynamics, so we can start to understand and start to predict behavior for regular conditions, but also learn how much variation we get in those abnormal conditions. Are they the same for all events? Do music concerts have a different temporal footprint compared to, say, football matches at the London Stadium in the park? Absolutely, they're at different times of day, they've got different durations. So we can start to quantify it in a way that we can be quite rigorous about. And so I'm just going to talk through two examples using the park. The first one is, well, how many people are in the park? You know, it's quite difficult to know. If we look at just this cell here that I've highlighted in red, how many people do we think are there? If we consult the census, you know, it's the most authoritative source on population data, it will give us a big fat 0 because there are no residential properties in that space. And for those that are aware that we have a workday population since the 2011 census, also 0 because parks aren't included in the rezoning for workday activities. So administrative data doesn't help us. Now, there are ambient sources, and this grid of which this cell's highlighted from is from a source called Landscan. They've divided the whole planet up into a grid of uniform cells, and they've attempted an ambient average. So they've taken residential data, but also land use information, transport information, satellite imagery, to try and come up with a more ambient average to reflect those spaces that aren't purely residential. And they think there's about 6,000 people here at any given time of any given day. But contextually, we know there could be at least up to 80,000, if not more. For the London Stadium, its capacity is 70,000 for music concerts. It's 50 to 60,000 for football and athletics events. But allowing for other people as well, we could potentially go up to 100,000 people at a time in this space. And this is where the mobile data can help. And this table that you're seeing here is a way of converting that ambient average that Landscan provides into an actual real number of people, because we know we can't just count mobile devices and say, well, we had 50 devices, so that's 50 people, because we know not everybody is using the app. We know there's a lot more than that. So we use the mobile data as a weighting to create our population estimate. We take our spatial baseline, which is the Landscan ambient average, and then we multiply it by a time weight that we generate from the mobile data. And in this table, so that first line, that's our spatial baseline, that's the S part of the star model. So Landscan estimates, it's a bit precise for my liking, 5,907 people on average, so let's say roughly 6,000. But using the mobile data, we learn that at 10 o'clock in the morning on a typical Friday with no events, it drops down to just a third. And we've ground truth that if you go to the park in the mornings, it's a pretty quiet place. But at 6 p.m. on a Friday, around about peak commute time, it's increased by over 2/3 because it's actually a lot of people traverse the park to get from places of work and transport hubs across to residential areas. So we see quite a significant increase. And then on an event day, we're seeing an order of magnitude increase in volume, and not just the increase, but we're also seeing that shift in pattern in terms of regulars to tourists. And actually these numbers are conservative because we came out with 55,000 when we were hoping for more like 70,000. So we're nowhere out, but it's an improvement on 0 for the admin data, or a complete static number that doesn't have any variation for the types of abnormalities that we know can take place in this space. The second example is to say, well, that tells us roughly how many people we think are in this space at a given time, but it doesn't tell us necessarily what they're doing. And another aspect that mobile data can give us that's not easily sourced elsewhere is to get a feel for dweller movement patterns. So if you look at the image on the left, these are the raw data points from the mobile data set. So they're just plotted, and I've just snipped it to a boundary covering the park and Westfield Stratford, the big retail centre that's right to the edge of it. As expected, you can see you've got this black mass, a lot of points are generated there. There's big transport hubs, there's lots of retail, it's like the biggest shopping centre in Europe. And we can see some pathways and that marked out across the park. Now, I'm not going to go, in 10 minutes, I haven't time, I'm not going to go into the details of all the maths and the machine learning in the background, but what we do is analyse the mobile data to define different active hotspots around the landscape. And then once we've got those active spaces, we measure the movements of devices going in and out of those active spaces. So how long are they in the active space for before they move on to another one? They can come back to it. That would be a new part of their trip, for example. And then what we've done is color coded them. So you can see the blue lines across on the right hand side. If my mugshot and everybody else's isn't completely blocking the image on your screens, the blue go across the part, that's traveling, so people are definitely in motion. But then we've got two types of dwell time. We've got what I've called as brief and dwell time, which is 5 to 20 minutes, 20 to 90 minutes. So these are likely to be ad hoc visits. It could be lunch breaks, it could be pausing, waiting to catch a bus. Whereas the red and the orange are longer visits. These are far more likely to be intentional visits. You know, they're up to 4 hours, that's attending a music concert or a football match. 4 to 6 hours, you could be at the athletics championships that take place all day in the park. And what's interesting in the Westfield area, which I actually can't see, so because I've got all the pictures over it, I'm hoping some can, if not I'll pull it out in the Q&A. But in Westfield, we can see that the majority in the cluster of the retail area is dwelling between 20 to 90 minutes, so shopping trips. There's some red clusters there for longer durations, but then at the top and the bottom of the retail areas, we see the briefer 5 to 20 minutes, which makes sense because that's where the transport hubs are, and that's where people are waiting for buses and trains, hopefully for not too long. So we can start to get more of a feel of an atmosphere. And again, we can start to do time analysis to say, well, how does this picture change for different contexts, and it does. But happy to go into that in more detail in the Q&A. It's worth always thinking about limitations. We can get some really rich insights from these mobile data sources and sense data sources, but they have their challenges. You know, how do we respect privacy and gain insights into behavior? This is a real tough nut to crack because we're using device IDs here. We completely anonymize them in a double way that makes it impossible to identify a person. But that's because we felt to be ethically responsible. It doesn't mean another person with a similar data source would follow that kind of criteria. We always have to ask, is the data representative of both the local and visiting populations? And they are two different populations too, which is something to bear in mind. Are all areas accessible for mobile data collection? Because sometimes they're not. And that's for mobile and, for example, Wi-Fi. So in the park, it has a Wi-Fi network. I've got a whole other set of examples using the Wi-Fi data, but it only covers the open space. It doesn't cover the actual event venues, which is quite interesting. Sensor-based sources, a key concern is whether the placement of sensors is creating bias. And we have actually started to see this in some towns, for example, with air pollution sensors, where they're not necessarily monitoring the areas at highest risk for people being there for an extended period of time. And we must always ask what behaviours and experiences cannot be captured by these data sources, because we're not getting a complete picture, and we need to be careful of that. We don't just make decisions only on these types of data. But to summarise, you know, spatial analysis gives us those generalised insights, and we need those. That's our absolute. Without those, we're in danger always with mobile data of seeing what we want to see. So that gives us that baseline. Space-time analysis then lets us start to layer up contextual insights. Having a framework enables us to focus on questions rather than data. And we're reaching a point now where this is important. When we have a lot of data, we can dive into it and play with it and come up with all sorts of things, but we need to start with good questions to know what, otherwise we will find what we want from the data if we're not careful. Administrative and land use methods that can give us robust baselines. Then the sensed and mobile data can give us that dynamic presence and experience, but combining the two together, we go from saying, well, we've got a range of 50 to 500 mobile devices to actually saying, well, that represents approximately 3,000 to 15,000 people, for example. We must have consideration for bias, privacy and ethics, and always, always think about what data is missing. And with that, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Fascinating, and is one area we have been obviously active in with Patrum. And it's really the easy bit is collecting the data, the difficult bit is using the data, and we've made it public available on the site, and we expect these towns to make use of it. But why should we expect them to be able to make use of it? It's not easy, is it? But it's fascinating, and COVID, if nothing else, it shows the system works in counting people. Obviously, there are a lot of things that aren't as positive about COVID, but that was one of them. There was one question that came up regarding tourism, because obviously in Wales, we have masses of tourists every summer. And would the system be able to tell us the return visits in terms of tourists? And so there may be 6 months between visits. Would it provide that type of intelligence?
So one of the challenges here, it comes down to privacy, because if you are storing device IDs, then potentially you could pick up somebody making a return visit in 6 months' time if you've kept that kind of data. The bigger question is, can you and should you keep that kind of data? So the way I anonymized within the park is literally we don't care from 1 month to the next if it's the same people. Deliberately, because we don't want to be tracking particularly the regulars and the locals. It's a sensitive topic for them. It was more important to just be able to get an idea of, do the volumes change, does the balance change? So I really expected with the mobile app data it would be overwhelmingly locals. I thought it was because it's quite a small number of actual mobile devices, and I thought it's going to be the same people coming to the park on a regular routine. And actually the data didn't hold that out. It was most times it was about 1/3 to 2/3 infrequent people within a single month, and I've got several months, and for each month it held, and then obviously it goes right up for the events. So one aspect is you can, but from an ethical, some privacy perspective, you need to be thinking very carefully how, if you're literally wanting to identify individuals versus being able to identify the balance of tourism. So the fact that obviously in some towns they're likely to have an extreme weighting towards tourism at certain times of the year that then drops dramatically at other times of the year, and you might actually want to be rebalancing that. For example, if you've got a cluster of towns that are working together and one may be being overwhelmed with traffic and congestion, there might be some smart ways you could look at trying to rebalance that tourism by having the data.
Which goes back maybe to what Ed was saying earlier on. So that's fascinating. Thank you.